questions. You can raise your hand or put Q in the chat, or Ray. I can see Ray. Please.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy. I really, really enjoyed this, and there's so much to learn from this as well. I just want to say that I just want to raise the question whether we can have something so general, because you're right that I was, focusing on the oppressive circumstances, which where of course it's much too sanguine for Pettit to assume that when there's some kind of legal protection for free speech, that's enough for it to for silence to mean consent. By the way, I can report, this is purely anecdotal, but I can report that when Philip Pettit was in the process of writing that, he was completely fascinated by the Jung Chan book about wild swans, about what it was like to be trying to speak or not speak under under oppressive regimes in China. Anyway, so I know that because but the obviously he's much too optimistic about that. But the different meanings of silence. Sometimes there can be a stony silence, and I mentioned that kind. There's a stony silence, which is a stony silence which freezes somebody out of the conversation, and the stony silence is not going along with what was said. And it's very hard to, as a philosopher of language, to say anything about what are the conditions that, make a stony silence not count as acquiescence or agreement or whatever. But the politics of oppression also play a role in that. And so, there's the famous Punch cartoon about, the people around the board table, and the chairman of the board says, "That's an excellent point, Miss Bloggs. Would one of the gentlemen here like to make it?" Anyway, so that's obviously that's a joke that my colleague at Newnham, Mary Beard, likes a lot, about how women get silenced and frozen out. And it's a funny example because, of course, it's being acknowledged as an assertion, but at the same time, it's not really counting as one, and you need to wait for it to be properly voiced. But so I just wonder whether there is anything general we can say about when it's enough to count as agreement. It's quite messy. But I was wondering also, and this is picking up on something that you said, I don't know how much this was in passing or not, something you said, depending how much hangs on it. Default consent is a big issue, not just in the sorts of questions we're talking about, but in, online assumptions, wills, living wills, what's going to be done with your property, what's going to be done with the information about you, etc. Some of us, some of us might think that it's a serious. I'm just going to throw this out there. Maybe one thing relevant to what hangs on it is what's at stake, and that the issue of stakes influences whether or not the silence counts as consent or not. And people will have different views about the stakes. And so, for instance, to take a not particularly politically, it's controversial, but it's not, triggering or anything like that. But the different countries have got different views about default consent on many different issues. So if I get killed in a car crash, can somebody harvest my organs to save someone else's life? It really makes a difference whether or not the issue of stakes prioritizes, the choice and autonomy of the person whose organs they are, or the greater welfare of society. And that's just one example where legally silence means consent in some jurisdictions legally, and silence doesn't mean consent in other jurisdictions, and they roughly track whether individual choice and autonomy, etc., matter, or whether the greater welfare of others matters. Anyway, so I'm just throwing out there that as an example. And also just wondering whether you think the stakes issue might be relevant to sorting out when it matters, or whether, I mean, basically I'd like you to acknowledge that it's a bit messier. And I'm wondering if we can make it a bit less messy by bringing in some other stuff, like stakes.
Great, thanks so much for that, Ray. So yes, hereby acknowledged. You are right, it is messier. And I welcome all ways in which to bring a bit more order to this mess. Stakes are an interesting one. I'll come back to it in a moment. Let me just say one thing, if I can, about your very nice reflection that should we expect a level of generality in a theory, even of conversational silence? I think this is the tenor of your worry, and I think that's a real worry. And I should say it is a worry that I had in mind when I was thinking about these things. So I'm going to try to tell you why I actually think I can accommodate that in ways that shouldn't make you worried. My thought is this: if I'm right, then in any context where you're in a conversation and you have no reason to think that it's not cooperative, there will always be a reason in play. That doesn't mean that reason will always be the strongest reason. The reason I like to postulate that reason is because what I have found is that even in contexts in which you wouldn't interpret the silence as consent, or sorry, as assent or agreement, I think the silence hypothesis, as you might call it, is always salient. And we have I think we have a nice explanation for why it's always salient. Namely, there's always a reason in play. So my thought is, if I don't know how strong that reason is. This is where I'm doing a lot of hand waving. But my thought is, if there's a way of determining how strong that reason is, then we can actually have a nice little theory that will predict exactly what are the other factors that can outweigh it. Stakes may well be one of them. I'm not exactly sure what I want to say about stakes, because the line that I run in epistemology leads me to be stakes, to not like to talk so much about stakes, but here. So let me just write you an IOU there. The only other point I want to make, and I'm sorry I'm speaking for so long. Legal context, I think, again, you're right, and they're very interesting. And my thought on legal context is, it makes perfect sense if a lot hangs on something, especially when it comes to consent, that the law actually make explicit that silence is or is not taken as consent. And so in a way, and I tried to argue for this in the book, you would predict that our legal systems would actually take a strong interest in making that and in clarifying that. And so in a way, I want to see that as yet more evidence that something like this might well be going on. But thank you so much, Ray, for those thoughts. That's really helpful.
Thanks for a really terrific paper. And anyway, lots to learn. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Liz, then David, and then Alessandra.
Thank you. I try not to go on too long because I don't want to be too mouthy. So I super enjoyed this, and I feel like you're making the sort of exactly the kind of shift that I would be inclined to make, which is you're staying sort of in a pretty strongly Gricean vein, but shifting away from speakers' intentions per se and into something about reasonable interpretation, And so I like that as, I'm sympathetic characterologically to that as a sort of like a minimal move, but I feel like there might be a more radical shift. And I don't know if it can do what you are. So if you could help me think through, because I'm interested in it too, as well. And so that's a thought from shifting from one really broad genus of meaning to another, which is to expression understood as like the outer signaling of an inner state, which has nothing to do with intention, right? It's a manifestation relation, right? So, and this picks up on like what Ray said, a stony silence is a different kind of silence than a smirking silence. And that's partly just, it embodies a different way of being. And there's a way in which that's not under your control. I mean, you could have been trying to be cooperative and friendly, and so partly that just like, that would cut out the issue of intentions altogether and just be, and it sort of, I feel like fits with the political case in the sense that, just by the very fact that you stood in the room with that guy, you expressed or manifested and enacted a certain way of being. You revealed something about yourself that you're responsible for and that has effects, right? So that it's like a more basic kind of meaning than making a move which contributes to a situation, a conversational situation in certain kinds of ways. So I'm wondering how much, whether you find that, you know, plausible or relevant. If so, I feel like maybe that takes us part of the way, maybe that's partly a relevant factor, but it still feels like that might feed into the conversational, the more distinctively conversational dynamics in ways that then you are analyzing in more precise terms. So I'm not sure if it's a alternative or an additional factor or what, or if you're friendly to it or.
Thanks so much, Liz. I appreciate that question. So I'm inclined to think of things like this, but when I say inclined, I haven't given this the thought that it deserves. The kind of thing that you're thinking about when you talk about signaling. So I often like to distinguish between signaling that's the kind of signaling, for example, this is what I mentioned to Alessandra when I asked her a question early on, where you can say, for example, the peacock's tail, the health of the peacock's tail signals that it's healthy. That I think is you probably do get some cases of that, but that probably isn't quite as interesting to me. And the reason that isn't interesting to me is because actually for a reason that you put your finger on at the tail end of this paper and that I can tell from your work, you've been deeply interested in as well, which is holding people to account. So there's a sense in which I'm thinking, so there are cases where I can hold a person to account even though she didn't intend to do something because she ought to have foreseen. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I think that requires more than the mere signaling that's in play when a peacock's tail means that it's signals that it's healthy. So what I want to do is I want to try to capture what you're calling that middle ground that is a kind of meaning that it does involve a bit of cognition, if you like, and a bit of our values. So in that sense, it's not like the peacock's tail, but it doesn't go all Gricean speaker meaning. That's really what I want to get at. So that would be my answer to you. Thank you for that question.
Right. Alessandra? I can't see you. Okay. Mike? You are muted, Alessandra.
Yeah, I can't hear you, Alessandra.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't muted and then I double clicked.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I enjoyed it very much, but as you know, I profoundly disagree. So let me try again why I think, right. So I actually think perhaps our views are not that incompatible, but here you go. In my view, you are presuming that silence is always following an assertion. And that's the only time that silence makes a contribution to conversation. I think that's patently false. And I think Ray's stony silence is exactly an example of that. It will come after a discursive intervention that might be an order, might be a request, And so I think silence, it's not true that silence either means assent or doesn't mean anything. I think silence can mean different things. And perhaps there are contexts, where it means assent, but I think there are as many contexts where it means dissent. Because the meaning of a silence tends to be second in a conversational stretch. And whatever meanings it has, I think, depend on what precedes it. And so you might be right on that little bit of silence, which is silence as the second move following an assertion. But I think there is more to conversational silence than that. And I'll stop there.
Great, Alessandra, thank you so much. And I should say as well, it's in conversations with you that I've been thinking a lot about these things as well. So I want to just start by expressing my gratitude to the many conversations we've had where we've had many disagreements, but I have found them very productive. If I gave you the impression that I think that silence only can mean assent and only in response to an assertion, then I gave a false impression. That's not the view at all. The view is this is a special case of a more general phenomenon, and I think I'll have to go back to the slides, but I think the way I define conversational silence is that it's anything that follows a conversational move where it is expected of you that you are going to respond and you meet the following conditions. My thought is that if you want a full significance of conversational silence, what you'll need to do is you'll need to identify for each type of illocutionary act, and even illocutionary act may not be the right, that still may be too thick grained. We may want a thinner grained, but for each type of illocutionary act, we have to identify what are the open available responses that are typically expected of people. And you also then have to bring in the rest of what's going on in the context or in the common ground in that conversation, and all of that gets thrown into the hopper to produce an interpretation of silence. This is the sense in which I agree with Ray's comment that it's really, really messy, and I'm simplifying a lot. But I do want to make sure I distance myself from the idea that it can only mean assent and it's only in response to an assertion, because I think I agree entirely with you. That's not true. Does that clarify, Alessandro? Or because again, if you disagree, I'd love, or if I said something with which you disagree, I'd love to hear, because I have found our, yeah.
No, I I agree with that. I suppose I think that silent is, is as important in these other uses, and I find these other uses of silence as a way of protest. I mean, it is, I think, a striking sociological feature. That many protests these days are silent protests,
Yep.
that there are days of silence and so on. I think it's sociologically interesting. And so I think as philosophers, we ought to be as interested in this stuff. So it's not a disagreement, it's just, let's not forget these are the roles, conversational roles that silence plays. Otherwise, no, I mean, I don't disagree with what
One
you
last minor point, and this is actually making your point with evidence that I got while I was thinking about these things. So I learned that in China, silence can indicate I opt out of this discussion, and it is actually an act of protest, and it's often done in the context where somebody who's not particularly a party person, that is a Communist Party person, is kind of disgusted with the ideology of the party being spread, and what they will do is they will remain silent in order to opt out of the conversation. And what's interesting, and this is to your point, I've asked my friends in China, they say, oh yeah, we can typically tell when a person is being silent for opting out. So that itself has become a salient interpretation. And I agree with you. I think a real full theory, which I haven't given here, had better be able to make sense of that as well. So I want to say thank you for that contribution.
Okay, next question from David.
Hi, thank you, Sanford, for a really great talk. I think this question kind of goes in a related direction to Ray's the first question, just asking about what to cover here. If we look at the direction you went in when you moved to political acts and silence in the face of political acts, I'm wondering, well, if we're carving nature at the joints, not that you said that this was a requirement of the theory, but one might think that we shouldn't restrict ourselves to silence that follows conversational moves, but might consider silence in the face of arbitrary moves. So let's suppose that a president of the United States doesn't just say it, but actually shoots someone on Fifth Avenue, right? Not hard to imagine right now, yeah? And no one says anything. There are a couple of forms of not saying anything. You can say something that doesn't address it. You can look the other way, right? You can lie. There are various things that would involve not speaking up about the, not saying this was wrong, yeah? And the silence that one talks about, in the case you mentioned Nazi Germany and other oppressive regimes, the silence that one talks about is not simply the silence of accepting. I mean, you already said that you don't want to narrow it to following an assertion. So it's not just the silence following an assertion or other speech act where someone says something horrible about some group and you just let it go, but actual silence in the face of action. So do you want the theory, or let me put it this way, do you think that there's a natural place to draw a line? Does anything about your theory depended only on the notion of default? And we can easily say that there seems to be a normative default that you speak up when someone does something bad, right? So there was nothing essential in that part of the theory that referred to the previous thing being a conversational move. So how big can you make it? Is there a natural place to draw a line to restrict the theory, or should it cover all those cases?
David, thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. You're actually asking the questions that I have been puzzling over for a while. I'm going to underscore what I'm about to tell you is my hope. Hope rather than, oh yeah, I'm confident this is right. My hope is that we theorists will be able to discern a parallel structure in all cases, in which case we'll be able to see conversational silence as a special case of a more general phenomenon. The reason I raised the two challenges to myself at the end were precisely because, all right, my thinking hasn't advanced so far. Here are two roadblocks that I see to thinking of what I've been doing as a special case of a much more general phenomenon, of which political silence is another instance. But my hope, my dream, is that we will be able to see a common structure in political silence and conversational silence, and that will be deeply revealing both about, if you like, the polis, but also about the kind of thing that we should theorize about when we're theorizing about conversational exchanges. That's my hope, David, but my thinking hasn't advanced so far, so I welcome any help on these matters.
Right. I'm not going to give you help, but I will mention there's lots of work in psychology on the bystander effect.
Yes, good.
And people's, and I think that ties into this lack of reaction, which can be, and this is not, I think, a case that you discussed, can be a kind of default. It must be someone else's case, someone else's responsibility by default, right? So that's a logic that, if applied at the level of the polis, can lead to silence by everybody.
Great. That's great. I appreciate you reminding me of this. Absolutely. Very nice. Thank you so much for that.
That's great. I think Jacobo had his hand raised.
Hey, thank you very much. I really loved your talk. I just had a question on a very minor point on the phrases you mentioned at the beginning in different languages, because I was wondering whether you were thinking more about the pragmatics of these actual phrases, and I thought that it could actually support your point. Not that you need it, but it would go in your direction, because I think it's. I mean, I was shuffling some examples, and I was thinking that it's actually pretty hard to consider cases where we use these phrases as factual descriptions. My guess is more that we tend to use them to do very specific things, and at least one of them is one where you were talking about too. So we try to wake up an audience, and we try to push them to react, because we want them to voice their dissent, for example, in a political context. Or on the other hand, we may be an oppressive meeting leader, for example, and we're trying to pass the minutes of the meeting or a specific policy. And so we say, when there's an awkward silence after we announced it, and then we just try to move on by this kind of dictum that is actually more, a way to impose something. So we're also trying to do something very specific. But it's not to say that nobody ever believed that descriptively the dicta have a meaning. At least Philip Pettit and a lot of people actually do also believe that theoretically. But at least in the everyday use of these phrases, I was wondering whether the pragmatics actually were more already akin to the kind of view you're proposing.
So is the thought, thank you for that suggestion, is the thought that the way we talk about, for example, spurring people to speak up, that's in line with the kind of thing that I'm talking about? Is that the thought? Yeah, I think that is right. I will say there's something really interesting, and I did a little bit of research on this, but not as much as I should, with respect to organizations that try to pass notes or minutes. It turns out that many organizations, and I think the UN might be one of them, they actually have an explicit rule called the silence procedure. It's actually made explicit, and the idea is that if nobody raises an objection in a certain period of time, that just is taken as agreeing with the minutes. And so I think you're right. You are putting your finger on something, and I appreciate that. If you have other examples of that, I'd love to have them. I think you're onto something.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have Jimena, then Christoph, then Karen. So Jimena.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for such a great talk. Well, I maybe shortly introduce my question. Well, it's actually a concern. I'm professionally a lawyer, so working on philosophy of language recently. So I'm gonna tell you about how we are tackling your thesis about silence, because actually we are doing that at the lab now, by the moment, experimentally testing some real situations, legal ones, and also daily life situations. By the moment, because the paper, the prospective paper is not ready yet, we were finding that one very strong component that makes people refrain to contest or to counter these kind of harmful speeches is a level of ambiguity. Also, Anna Baumertz from Max Planck in Berlin is working in these issues, telling that normally people are not very clear when you test and asking them, for example, you are in a bus and you are sitting next to one person that begins to shout to the other and telling some harmful speeches. And normally the participants, and we test in very huge groups within the European Union, of course, but what I mean with this is that I'm not taking in account different cultural backgrounds. But within the European Union, we have a very, very non-differentiation between how people assess that silence indeed is like a petition. They are also saying yes, they are agree with what has been said, or indeed they are, as Alessandro mentioned, that they are refusing to participate because they are showing their rejection. We find in the lab that we can't find statistically significant results that tell us that indeed there are a clear position. This what us the lawyers call the reasonable person, the normal person medium that could tell us that indeed in real cases, in the scenarios, because we take our scenarios for the vignettes from real legal cases that are now in court, this level of ambiguity makes people not being clear what is really happening. So more than they are not feeling that it's not a cooperative environment, or that they are, I don't know, maybe not politically engaged with some kind of discourses, or they really are not paying attention, maybe. More than that, normally we show, at least from the moment with our experimental evidence, is that people are not clear what is really happening when they are not the specific target of these speeches, of this speech. So I'm wondering how your proposal can give us a better panorama about how to deal with this level of ambiguity that real life gives to this kind of discourses, harmful ones. That is the first one. And the second one, and maybe related, is that do you think or are you having in mind some different treatment? Because when you speak about audience, you have the second person, the interlocutor, the direct interlocutor, but also the third person, the bystanders, or maybe the observers that even are present. Do you have in your proposal any distinction about how liable or how responsible they should be? Are you contemplating different levels of responsibility when you are tackling these two different parts of the dialogue, of the social dialogue? Thank you so much in advance.
So Jimena, I have to say, absolutely marvelous. I can tell that you have been thinking about these issues for a long time. First, a request, when you write that paper, if you would send me a copy of the paper that you're going to produce, I would love to see it, because my guess is that I will learn a tremendous amount from you. And I only hope that I can give you something worthwhile back right now that will become close to whatever it is that I'm going to learn from your paper when you have it. I don't know that I'll be able to fulfill that standard, but a couple of things. On your last point, I love that you made the distinction between bystanders and if you like, the audience, or even not the audience, maybe the addressee. In the 2020 book, I was obsessed about the difference between an addressee and an audience. And in fact, I concluded, although I left this out of the book because what I have to say about it is so not well thought out, that I couldn't keep it in the book. I concluded that being a participant in the conversation is actually to be in a normatively structured environment. So the distinction between a person who is and a person who is not a participant in the conversation brings in a ton of normativity as soon as you do that. And I said to my grad students at Northwestern, does anyone want to write a dissertation on the conditions on counting as being a member of a participant in a conversation? And all I did is succeed in convincing them that it's an extremely difficult question that I haven't solved. So the short answer is yes, I did have that distinction in mind. I do a bit with that distinction, albeit not in connection with silence. Keep in mind, I'm not interested so much in liability as you are. This is the reason why I would love to read your paper. I'm just interested in, is my behavior doing something that for which other people now have a reason to regard me as accepting? And there, I think the answer is yes. So in that sense, I am liable. That's a different sense of liable from the one I think you're working on. The other point you made about ambiguity, and I'm sorry I'm speaking so long, I'll try to keep this brief. That's a lovely point. I don't know that I can give you anything that would help with ambiguity. The one thing that I have become cautious about myself, and this has nothing to do with silence, it has to do with my work in the epistemology of testimony. I often hear psychologists say, you know, Sandy, I'm sorry to tell you, but we tend to suck at how well we can tell whether a person's lying or not. So if you think that we have to be able to tell how well a person is lying or not in order to be justified in believing them, so much the worse for your theory. That's an argument that I've gotten. I actually have come to think that argument distorts things tremendously, and it distorts things as follows. I'm going to make a bunch of empirical assumptions, but one of them is, in real life, we do not encounter the kinds of liars that you often encounter in a psychology experiment. In real life, people tend to be much more reliable, or at least they're trying to be reliable, than they're going to be in one of a psychological experiment. And the result is that what we're doing when we monitor other people for reliability doesn't have to be that competent in order for the effect of all of this to be that, nevertheless, a great preponderance of the beliefs that I form when I trust other people are true. So I've learned to be a little careful before I structure my theory around what the psychologists tell me about their cases, in the same way that I wonder whether, in this case, these kinds of cases might make for bad principles with respect to the effects of silence, just because they're so hard. That's why they came before a court of law. So there's my long answer. I apologize it's so long. Please send me that paper when you have it. I would love to learn from you guys.
I would love to send you. Thank you so much for the
Thank
answer.
you. Mahela, I think you're muted.
Christoph is next, and then Karen.
Yeah, I was thinking of the trolling example as an interesting case study where the Gricean principle of cooperation is kind of interesting what silence does, right? So in a lot of these online communities, I'm not just talking about Twitter, but like it could be YouTube, it could be any kind of social network streaming service nowadays. Like once you have a certain online community, let's say there's an influencer and you have a group of people who follow that influencer regularly, oftentimes you have certain social norms emerging in these communities as well. And so they have their own rules of what the Gricean principle of cooperation entails in these online conversations. So whenever a troll enters that conversation, it is well understood that you should not engage the troll. So there's the kind of neglect and the protest, I'm not going to engage with you. But the interesting thing, and that's what I was thinking, is silence towards the troll by the influencer also has a communicative aspect towards the other people who are regulars in the community, right? So because to them it's signaling, I know what I'm doing, you should also not engage the troll. And then everyone agrees that that is the accepted social norm. And if the troll keeps persisting, then sometimes even you see people stepping in saying, okay, this is enough. Like you should just, we're not going to engage with you. Just making it literal, what's going on. So this is kind of an interesting case where the silence towards the troll is actually a social signal that you are being cooperative, because being silent in that community is a signal of following the rules, right? So it's kind of interesting. You're sort of flouting the principle towards the troll, but you're also very much strengthening the group identity and the sense of belonging and banding together towards the troll.
Christoph, that's a really lovely example. Thank you for that. Beautiful. So my thought on that one is, I love the example, and I actually I'm now thinking that I've got to join groups that are more like that, because I actually think that's probably more effective than what happens in some of the groups of which I'm a member. My thought there is that here I, like Liz was saying earlier, I have been very influenced by Christina Bicchieri's comments on the role of social norms and how that changes the practical situations that we all face. My inclination is, once you introduce new social norms, and certainly they can be introduced, you change the dynamics in such a way that any theory had better be able to assimilate that. And the way that I would try to do that is, I would try to say, if you have these new social norms, they themselves give you reasons. They give you reasons to interpret silence in a new way, especially if it's salient to everyone exactly what's going on. So if you're all on page that that's a troll, then that reason is going to be salient, and that reason will carry the day. That's how I would try to think about these cases, but I love that example. So if you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear follow-up thoughts on that. That's the way I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, there's certain communities where you have regulars on a regular basis. Like there's a lot in the esports gaming community. They have these huge tournaments, but they also have these small regular streams, and it's more like a sort of like a social club sort of setting where you have lots of regulars, and every time someone new comes in, it's always like, who is this person? Is this person going to be nice? Is it going to be a troll? Is it going to be someone who's just stumbled upon it? And there's kind of like a regular club. There's like a vetting process where the community is sort of feeling out new people and seeing if they fit in with the social of that group. And it's kind of interesting how they negotiate that. And it's very clear that they, like you said, like maybe we want to think about this in terms of their own rules, and then cooperation in the Gricean sense entails sort of a different set of rules than in real life, in the offline world. There are quite different communities compared to like Twitter and Facebook, where there's not as much hostility and more of a group sense.
Yep. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. Just one quick comment. I'm down on my computer now to about 3%. So if I kick off, it's not because I'm irritated. It's because my computer has died and I'll have to go to my other computer. But with that, I pass it back to you, Mihaela.
So we have Karen. Hopefully.
Karen, great to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too, Sandy. Can you hear me? There's a lot of jackhammering going on in the background. Sorry. Okay. So I wanted to ask about the Gricean rationale itself, because I agree with some of the earlier comments that there are different kinds of silencing it doesn't cover. And you also mentioned, it can be outweighed and it's defeasible, but I'm not convinced it even applies in sort of like the central cases that you're thinking of. And sort of what I'm imagining is a case in which somebody speaks and then all the conversational participants, maybe there's just one other person, maybe it's everyone, is just silent. And then I'm trying to imagine the Gricean rationale, the conversation just ends. And sometimes, in very specific cases, I think this rationale will apply. And sometimes it might be appropriate for the conversation to end. But sometimes that's going to seem wildly weird and wildly uncooperative. And if, Grice doesn't have a maxim about turn taking, but something in sort of the Gricean spirit certainly does. And suddenly nobody takes their turn. And if I'm going to do some reasoning about cooperativity, I don't think I'm going to end up with the conclusion that my audience agrees with me if all of a sudden the conversation just comes to a grinding halt.
Great. Yeah, that's a great example. And I will say, so part of what inspired me in this book, and I think you actually know this book quite well, is the using language by the what does it remind me? I forgot his name, at the psychologist at Stanford.
Herb Clark.
Thank you, Herb Clark. So Herb Clark that book is full of examples like the kind that you're talking about, and he certainly talks about turn taking. My impression is that what I have to do here, Karen, is I have to complicate the story a bit. So the examples I'm using already are Tinker Toy. What you're pointing out is how Tinker Toy they are. I think what I would want to do is I'd want to say, look, cooperativity is the thing that drives all this, but that's not the end of the story. You also have to bring in this idea of turn taking. You might even say that turn taking itself is something that is cooperative, and not taking your turn is not cooperative. And then I would want to see whether, once I bring in not just Grice, but also some of the really interesting things that Clark says in that book, could I get the kind of interpretation that you're talking about? I agree with you on the facts. That would be a bizarre conversation, and I would not think that that's just, okay, they've all accepted. But that's just to say I've done a lot of hand waving in this talk. Maybe the best thing I can pitch right now, and if I have you on board for this much, I'll feel a little more confident that this is the core of a good idea that then has to get spelled out much further in order to accommodate all the kinds of cases that you're thinking of. Does that strike you as right, or does that strike you as this is dead in the water at the start, or something in between?
So I think something in between. So I was thinking there, I mean, you've thought about this a lot more. I've been thinking about it, just since you started this talk. But some of the things I was thinking about, for certain cases, it strikes me as exactly right. For me, sort of the case that comes to mind where this would be, I think, exactly the right sort of reasoning would be in a conversation with at least 3 people where one person is silent and the other person doesn't reject you. The conversation just moves on normally. And I think the silence of the sort of one of the people in the conversation really can be interpreted based on sort of the same reasoning, the reasoning that you give as not being a rejection, right? Because for the very reasons that you give, because if it should be a rejection, then they should have interjected at that point in the conversation. I also think there are conversations where it might be natural, given what was just said, that the conversation could be coming to an end, right? Where you might not think the conversation coming to an end is an uncooperative or startling thing, because conversations come to ends. And you might think precisely because it just ended at that point and then there was silence, that everyone agreed with you and everyone is happy. And I think, again, for the reasons that you give, that seems very plausible. But then I think there's a whole host of other examples where I find this not plausible for the reasons I said, and for some of the reasons other people have given the varieties of silence.
So I think the take-home lesson I'm taking from your comment, and also as you rightly note from the comments of others, it would be good, and I will take this on as something that I'll think about, to think about the range of cases and where paradigmatically this kind of theory gets it right, and paradigmatically this theory doesn't seem to have the resources just yet to predict those things. And can it be supplemented in principled ways, not just in an ad hoc way? That's extremely helpful. And I have to say, I will think about that. The other thing I want to mention, and you mentioned this, and I got this from Clark as well. I came to think that conversation opening moves and conversation closing moves are extremely important, and that the norms governing them are probably more complicated than I certainly can think of in my armchair. And I want to think about that a lot more as well. And I think you're onto that too.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we have a comment from Zubaydah. If you're here, do you want to, or I'm not sure, Sandy, if you want to respond, or
if Zubaydah is here and Zubaydah would like to speak up, I would be happy to defer. Otherwise, I will read that. Is Zubaydah here? And
Zubaydah, are you here?
Okay, then let me just give me 1
She
second.
has sent a comment in the chat. She has just explained that she has a bad internet connection and can't speak.
Great, thank you so much. I'll read it. So I'm going to read this out loud. In Turkey, during the Gezi protests, spontaneously one person, we call him Standing Man, decided to stand still and stay silent in front of Gezi Park, staring at Ataturk Cultural Center. A very long time he stood there. Some other people also joined him. First, people did not understand what was going on, but then people started to make sense of it. And whatever the meaning of it for the people, agreement or disagreement or another thing, his just standing there and being silent became a very big offense to the police and government. I agree with Alessandra. Silence can also mean disagreement, but can also mean more than that. What I mean is it could say different things to the same people at different times or groups. And Zubaydah, what I want to say is, yeah, I think you're right. This is a fascinating case. I don't quite know what to think about that case in particular, in part because I'm ignorant about the greater details. But surely real life cases, especially when there's a political context that's deep, are going to require a lot of contextual knowledge in order to know what's going on. And including for people that are within the cultural context, they may have a hard time interpreting what's going on. But I love this example in part because it shows you how complicated these things can be. I like to think that's a problem for every theory of silence. But I think you're right to point out as well that it had better be that my theory is at least compatible with whatever the best story is there, even if it can't give you what the explanation is. So I appreciate that very much. And again, if you want to follow up on that, I will try to follow the chat. And thank you for that comment.
Okay, and a final comment from Liz. Yes.
Liz, I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I was just, I'm following with real interest all this like variation. I totally feel this compelling that there's like, there's really, look at all the proverbs. I mean, silence is acquiescence, right? But then, oh, it really is these powerful protests. So I'm just trying to think about how to get systematicity, like how do we sort these cases in any way? One thing I was wondering about is whether, right, so I think this is right, David, is whether at issue peripheral or like presuppositional versus implicature or whatever could be something that would help to like just, and David's saying he's thinking it's cross-cutting. I think that seems right, but just I'm just trying to think about factors that we can ascend to a higher level of structural analysis to try to get some, clarity here. And I don't think power dynamic, and that would be another like power differential would be one to look at, but I don't think that's necessarily going to do it either. So yeah, I don't know. I think my next step would be, I might just go do this myself. Like look like for 10 factors I think could possibly be relevant here, and then start to see if I can collect cases. But it's really cool how it's really powerful and really variant, and
Yeah, you put your finger on exactly why I find this so interesting and so elusive at the same time.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that's great. That is great.
So since we're moving towards the last half an hour of open discussion, I welcome you to ask further questions for all participants while we carry on discussing the points that, in a way, like what seems to me is like, is there a way of kind of defining what type of conversation or game we're in as a way of kind of distinguishing between, do the rules of cooperativity apply, or are we in a sort of more conflictual, competitive type of game? Would that be a way of kind of determining, the roles of participants in the game, their kind of what, and the expectations that we have depending on how we think that the kind of game we're in, and in particular, like if you think of slurs or any oppressive speech, that doesn't strike me as being a game in which cooperativity is something that we expect. So I mean, even basic questions like, is the addressee of a slur, does he count as a participant? I mean, he's been just co-opted in this game as a way of like a forced move. So what would we say about those cases?
The other kind of complication I'd love to introduce, this goes back, I think, to Bianca's really nice talk, how we think about importing our theories to the online context, because that's something I've also wondered about. And that's one of the reasons I appreciated what Bianca was saying. I would love to think about that as well.
Yeah. In particular, defining that the type of audience that you are aware that you have, or you might not know who's in the audience. But also, I know, I mean, the online communication, it's sort of, it kind of brings a whole host of, how communication develops on a different scale, and sort of with the networks, anyway, so Liz, did you have a point? I saw your.
Well, I wanted to follow up. I guess I was thinking about the online. I liked what Christoph was saying a lot about the thing, and this fit with something I was thinking about, trying to do more. I liked what you said, Sandy, in response. Like, I need to be part of those communities. Like, I just thinking about the contingency of the culture of, it's not just a cooperative environment, like conversations about, they're contingent particular cultures of ways in which communication proceeds, and that those are base level sort of structures, but then that affect conversations in structural ways, and that's worth exploring more. And we haven't really thought about that in our zeal to be like super abstract. But then I was also, so that's what I was just thinking about. And then I was wondering more, I wanted to ask him and more about this like really cool work that you're talking about. And I guess I was wondering, so I was thinking about the interaction between that point about Christoph's point about the contingency of particular cultures of conversation, and then Jimenez's point about ambiguity. So one thing I wasn't clear about was whether you had tested for like cases of reduced ambiguity. Like, do you get people to be more likely to act or to, you know, and can you get it to flip one, you know, to be silent or to act? Can you get it flip one way or another, depending on by reducing ambiguity? And then also I was thinking about maybe there are ways in which, you know, different conversational cultures might be more or less amenable to persistent ambiguity and interpretation or whatever. And so I was wondering how those might interact, but it's not a question. I was just turning over in my mind how all these various great comments that people have made might interact.
Well, definitely experimentally approaching this. We work with this, as you know, with these independent and dependent variables. So in the part of our dependent variables, we are quite clear to ask people if they are understanding a silence as an action, as an inaction, or some maybe other reason, like not paying attention, or maybe it's because they are, I don't know, in a sense of fear or any other reason that can leave or explain this kind of inaction. But in the independent variable level, we were trying to fit different independent variables until try to reach this statistically significance that can lead us to say that indeed the perception, the social default perception, goes from one sense or the other. So reducing the ambiguity, as all of these speech and discourses are so highly context dependent, it's so difficult because you need to put apart any specificality for the context, being secure that the participants are conscious or are aware enough that what is happening, if they understand that they are also get involved, because also another interesting finding is that many people consider that they, as observers, as bystanders, this maybe we are so, as philosophers, we are so aware about our role as speakers in the social dialogue. But when you jump to the real society, to folk intuitions, normally people feel that it's not their business, and the level of indifference is such a big stuff. What is it's amazing, because for me, at least as a lawyer too, was quite shocked when I was working with my colleagues that are psychologists or neurologists, and checking that indeed people normally they don't feel that they are they need to manifest their self in one sense or the other. So to try to reduce this ambiguity, we are putting them, like trying to push them feel concerned about that, of having any extra interest. Next step may be gonna be to also apply some kind of game theory, trying to give some kind of reward or compensation that makes them feel that they need to make a move, but it's still an open question, because it's theoretically tackling this kind of topics is easy to presuppose that the people indeed feel that they have an active role in the social dialogue. But the levels of indifference in our society nowadays, I think, also challenge that point of view.
Yeah, I would like to hear about the results. And
yeah, well, Ophelia, I work with Ophelia de Roy and send you many many greetings. Yes.
Yes, especially when you think about, indeed, yeah.
Actually, I have another question about, for the speaker. Was for me very interesting your recalls about the Paul Grice theory. So in that sense, for me, is I'm not a philosopher as you all, but I read Grice. So my question is why you tackle the silence as an action. If words, when we do things with words, a silence is not an inaction. And I'm going to explain why is my concern. It's like, as a lawyer, that my concern raised, because for example, when you try to establish such a kind of liability or responsibility in third persons that are not directly affected, the only possibility, legally talking, is that that you can ask them to act in some way. You can't say that they should enact in some way, because this is not possible legally and also maybe rationally too. So, for example, I'm going to put this as concrete as possible. When we have this general duty to help someone that is in danger, and we have these legal cases that you are, I don't know, looking at your window and then suddenly a car crash and you need to act. You are the third person, you are not responsible, you are not harming no one, you are not even the victim, it's not the relative, it's not, no one would relate with you. But you have that duty, and legally you could be even liable because you are avoiding to take action. But if you, so I am really interested in the philosophical approach that why we are considering silence as an action, because if we consider that silence is an action, that leads to completely different consequences in real life. I mean, theoretically, I deeply respect all the work that has been done, and I'm not gonna come here to try to change all those perspectives, but to give maybe this I don't know, interdisciplinary approach to this phenomena. And I'm really interested in why we finally choose to call silence as an action and not as an omission to act, as an omission to do things with our words. So in that sense, if we are indeed have something that can change the situation, and we are not doing nothing against something that is related with human rights in some cases, or even to prevent some crimes in the case of hate incidents in legislation or hate crimes, is not going to be maybe more interested to consider as an inaction. Maybe so naive, or maybe an outsider question, but I'm deeply interested.
No, Jimena, my own 2 cents, and I'll be brief here. My own 2 cents is you're exactly right. And in fact, you put your finger on one of the reasons why I wanted to resist Pettit's idea. Pettit's idea was that silence actually can be taken to be speaker meaningful. So he is thinking of silence as an act. I wanted to say, look, there are times where I think silence is an action that you perform. And there are times when it's not an action you perform. It is exactly as you say, an omission, and nevertheless, it's still significant. It's a significant contribution to the conversation. So I actually think I'm on your side on that one. I think silence can be seen as an omission and still significant.
Okay, because also if we consider freedom of expression and we consider this silence as an action, we begin to have a conflict, because in freedom of expression, you are free also to express or not express. The only reason that legally possible lead us to oblige someone to speak is when you are making an action through this speak, that you are indeed in an inaction and you are being asking for taken action. I don't know if I'm transmitting correctly what I have in mind.
Ray has a thought. Yep.
It's just a very quick follow-up. I mean, I really appreciate what you just said, Jimena, but I would have thought that even in the legal context, there are cases where silence is, I don't mind whether you call it an act or an omission, but it's very legally significant. So, I'm just going back to J.L. Austin and the idea that marriage is a performative, and saying I do is marrying someone in the right context. But there's a moment in the marriage ceremony when the celebrant says, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." And if nobody then speaks now, then that is one of the felicity conditions for the marriage being valid. So I think that certain absences of speech are also felicity conditions for speech acts, even in a legal context. But I think it's a hugely interesting question, and it's great to have your response to what Sandy is doing, and I'm interested in very much both sides of this. This is a really fantastic first day, by the way, Mahela. Thank you I'm gonna have to go in just a minute.
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Wonderful discussion. Thank you.
I'm going to say bye.
Goodbye. So yeah, it's interesting. I came across this ideas of indeed silence as inaction or omission, but at the same time, you think a mission is a type of action. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, how to disentangle and whether it matters. I mean, clearly to me, it counts as a move in a game, insofar as you are expected by. But yeah, I think from a legal point of view, it's more important to really be clear whether it counts as an action or inaction and what that means.
Yeah, actually taking into account also the high respect of freedom of expression, I think is when the problem comes, because if you are considering that you need to put some duty on people, and you can ask them to take an action against something that is happening, that is harmful, but you can't. If they are not directly related, if they are not the perpetrator, you can't in advance or ex ante put a prohibition to say something or to act without being censored, without being censoring, without falling in censoring. That was the point that for me immediately, as I was when we begin the project, for me, it was quite natural to think that silence is an omission to act, at least for the philosophical background that I have, and in philosophy of language, and then comes into a discussion that I also have heard the points that the speaker have raised in the speech, and of course is a very interesting philosophical issue. Since my interest in hate speech and all these harmful discourses are more how we landed all of this great knowledge to put it in society directly. Actually, I'm combining my practicing as a lawyer with the PhD thesis only for finding this, because it's a huge stuff. And then for me, maybe the focus is how we can make it more practical to indeed try to develop a policy and give to politicians this knowledge because this is raising in the UK the last 3 years it's almost double the hate incidents in hate speech is enormous, the effect that is having in society.
Yeah, indeed. I think some measures in terms of policy are greatly needed. Yeah.
I'm going to go for some water. Thank you so much, Mihaela.
I suppose most of people have dropped, and if there are no questions, I guess we can call it a day. It was wonderful to have great speakers and a lively discussion, and so great food for thought. So we will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we start at 3 o'clock European time, and then you can check the schedule for your own time. Thanks again, everyone, and see you tomorrow. Bye. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Mihaela. Thank you.
Thanks.